I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, amid renewed Russian bombardments across the entirety of Ukraine, we consider the impact of new weapons of war. Then, our first formal dispatch from the frontline city of Kharkiv.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday the 13th of December, 2 years and 299 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, dialing in from the United States, I'm joined by Michael Bohnert of the RAND Corporation. And later, in our interview, Oleh Synyehubov, who is the governor of Kharkiv Oblast. But first, the latest military and political updates. In yesterday's episode, we raised the question some analysts have been asking: why has there been a reduction in Russian airstrikes? Is it connected to Kyiv's ability to strike deeper into Russian territory, or is Moscow saving up material for larger strikes required to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure? Well, we may have had an answer last night, as Ukraine suffered one of the biggest air attacks for some time across the entire country. 93 missiles and over 200 drones. The government claims 81 of the missiles were intercepted, including, interestingly, 11 of them by the new F-16 fighter jet squadrons. The targets, predictably, were the energy grid and defence industry in all regions. The app, which highlights areas of the country at risk to warn residents, flashed red across the entire country yesterday. Now, President Zelensky said in a statement this morning, "Another Russian missile strike against Ukraine. Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. This is Putin's peace plan, to destroy everything. This is how he wants negotiations, by terrorizing millions of people. A strong reaction is needed from the world. A massive attack must be met with a massive reaction. This is the only way terror can be stopped. If leaders fear responding or become accustomed to terror, Putin sees it as permission to continue. Patriots are needed to shoot down these missiles and prove that terror will not achieve its goals. Sanctions against Russia for the war must be strengthened to genuinely impact Russia's missile production. Putin won't be stopped by empty talk. Strength is what is needed to bring peace. Strength that is not afraid of its ability to confront and stop evil. The world can stop this madness, and to do so, it must first stop the madness in Moscow that has been ordering terror for over 20 years. Strength is what is needed. Ukraine is grateful to everyone who is helping." So the remarks of President Zelensky there following those bombardments. The damage doesn't seem to have been too significant, with sources saying that critical infrastructure is operating normally. But if this attack by Moscow were sustained, would that remain true? That is the key fear. And suffice to say, there will undoubtedly be the losses of lives of innocent people as a consequence of these attacks. And we must always remember that. Turning to the land war next, Russian forces have pushed further south of Pokrovsk, intensifying their offensive operations as they close in on that city. Footage geolocated by the ISW confirmed that Russian troops have now seized Novotroitsky, the southwestern settlement of Pokrovsk, and advanced to a windbreak just west of the town. They are tightening the noose from multiple directions, but there are conflicting reports about the extent of Russia's control. Some mill bloggers claim that Moscow captured the village of Pushkin and sent reconnaissance teams into the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. However, independent sources have yet to verify those claims. Heavy fighting reportedly continues in Shevchenko, where Ukrainian forces are launching counterattacks to try and reclaim lost ground. Ukrainian military spokespeople acknowledge that Russian forces are now only 6 to 10 kilometres from Pokrovsk, with troops attempting to bypass the town's main defences by advancing on its flanks rather than launching a frontal assault. In a sign of possible manpower shortages, Russian soldiers have been spotted using unarmoured vehicles for personnel rotations and moving in small groups of 2 to 3 people, well below the size of a typical combat unit. Now, another significant region of activity this week is Kursk, where Russia continues to push and make some gains around Plekhovo, southeast of Kurilovka, and recaptured, some say, Plekhovo itself. Though unverified, reports suggest they are pressing into the forested areas near Sudza, Sudza being that key settlement we've talked about so often and which many journalists have visited. But it's not all going the Kremlin's way. In Luhansk, Ukrainian forces have clawed back territory near Savatove along the fiercely contested line between Kupiansk, Savatove and Kreminna. On December the 11th, geolocated footage confirmed the recapture of Kupanki. So those are the major military developments in the past 24 hours, but I'll be turning to Michael shortly for a deeper dive on some of those themes, so just hold that thought. But first, a little more on spycraft following yesterday's episode on shifting espionage strategies. A Russian scientist known for developing cruise missiles has been found shot dead in a snowy, wooded area near Moscow, with Ukraine's intelligence service claiming it assassinated Mikhail Shatsky, the deputy director of Moscow-based ballistics engineering units. Anyone who is involved in the development of the Russian military-industrial complex and support of Russian aggression in Ukraine, one way or another, is a legitimate target. Those are the words of a Ukrainian defence source speaking to the Kyiv Independent. It's not possible to independently identify the body as that of Shatsky from footage alone, although a close-up of the face showing the dead man as a trademark dark moustache. Shatsky was a lead scientist at the Kremlin's Mars Design Bureau, which specialises in developing on-board automatic control and navigation systems for aircraft and missiles. He had been credited with working on secret Kremlin plans to incorporate AI technology into Russian drones and aircraft. He also oversaw the modernisation of the Kh-59 and Kh-69 cruise missiles, which the Kremlin has fired, of course, at Ukrainian cities. Moving on, the latest development in the trial taking place here in Britain, which we discussed together yesterday, is that the Russian spy ring plotted to exploit the small boats crisis going on here at the moment as small boats try and travel across the channel in order to abduct a journalist in the UK. Quite an extraordinary one breaking as we came on air, and more on that as we get it next week. But turning to the US next, and the ever-vital question of Trump's position. He's given an interview to Time magazine, though crucially we don't know when it was done, where he said that he vehemently disagrees with the decision to permit Ukraine to strike targets within Russia with US-supplied long-range missiles. Discussing those weapons, the president-elect said the policy switch by Biden's administration had escalated the war between Russia and Ukraine and made things worse, describing it as a foolish decision. However, he pledged not to abandon Ukraine in his planned negotiations and said that you can't reach an agreement if you abandon, in my opinion. Now, the criticism made on the long-range missiles will, and I should say, I know many people say they're not long-range missiles, they're medium-range, but Dom covered that the other week, so we'll just use the terminology that's widely understood for now. The long-range missiles will disappoint many, especially those who think that an increase in support is on the cards come February from Washington. But bear in mind that Washington hasn't yet tried and potentially failed to bring Russia to the negotiating table yet. If it does, that might well change the calculations. Connected with all this, the former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev met with Xi in Beijing yesterday, where they discussed the situations in Syria and Ukraine and highlighted the bilateral Russia-China relationship and their cooperation in multilateral institutions. Xi reiterated the standard Beijing stance on the war in Ukraine, calling for de-escalation and advertising China's Friends of Peace initiative that it put together with Brazil. No surprises there, but it does underscore whose side Beijing is on. And just lastly, Putin awarded yesterday, in quite an interesting development, I thought, the Russian Golden Star Medal to a military correspondent for the first time since the Second World War. The Kremlin is continuing to use state awards to co-opt mill bloggers and gain control over the Russian information space. The Kremlin is significantly investing in information operations aimed at sowing discord among international allies and destabilising democratic societies globally. Russia's draft 2025 budget allocates over $1.42 billion to state propaganda, a 13% increase from 2024. These funds surpass annual regional budgets in Russia, just to give you a sense of the scale. The culmination of these efforts is anticipated around huge geopolitical moments, including, of course, the upcoming US presidential inauguration, as Russia will no doubt seek to disrupt Ukraine's diplomatic engagements with the new administration. It is noticeable, I think, how much Moscow appears to be on the back foot when a so-called black swan event occurs, like we've seen in Syria in the last fortnight, versus when there's a predictable date that Moscow can try and craft a narrative for, when, as it were, the bots and the mouthpieces are lined up to sing from the same hymn sheet, or scream from it, might be more accurate. So, interesting developments, but let's turn back now to the battlefield and some of the key questions raised in recent episodes. Michael, thank you again very much for your time. Let's start with American deliveries. There's been a lot of reporting, of course, on the recent remarks by Biden and Sullivan in terms of the gifting of more weapons. But have we seen a significant increase in impact from that, is my first question. And indeed, what are these weapons that are being given? Michael, thank you as ever for your time.
Francis, thank you once again for having me on the pod. So since the election, there have been 4 sets of allocated by the White House. 3 are presidential drawdown authority. So what that means is those are weapons taken from U.S. stocks and immediately provided. And one of them is through the Ukraine assistance, which is things are purchased either from U.S. or other parts of the market. So I will say in general, it's been focused very heavily on HIMARS ammunition and counter-UAS systems and other capabilities that are used for UASs, such as mortars, some of the other energetics used for that. So that's very good because those are things that Ukraine does use very heavily, as well as the security assistance that buying from the market is buying unmanned systems, which could either be supporting Ukraine production or buying from elsewhere where that's probably the highest untapped capacity of any type of munition. Otherwise, it's your standard packages of artillery, javelins. However, one thing to note that is new, and you might be able to thank Hamish a little bit for this one, is we are seeing an uptick in providing chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear protective equipment, as we've talked about some of the chemical weapons usage. So that's one thing that's different, but for the most part, it's definitely in the ammunition that's hard to capture from the open market.
Well, thanks, Michael. So when it comes to the question then of impact, are we seeing this having an impact on the battlefield? Or is this something that really, because of the pace in which it's arriving, we're not really seeing massive changes, do you think?
Frankly, this is what I would have expected at the current rate from August until now. So there was a bit of a dip in the months during the election as it was happening. So some of this is just a much of continuation of the rate of supplies prior to August, July. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a huge deviation. It's more of a continuation of the existing trend.
Interesting. I remember you and I were chatting on air perhaps a month or two ago now on what more Biden could do if the will was there. And there have been some pretty punchy remarks by National Security Advisor Sullivan. Is there much more that can be done in the time frame now when we really are just talking about a handful of weeks? Or do you think the window of opportunity has now passed?
There is one thing that could be done that they've done before but didn't do here. And those were those 70 millimeter rockets I mentioned. Those are something that they could donate. They're very versatile. And there's a lot of those already in Europe because they're helicopter based. Actually, Dom might have used some back in his day. So that's something they could provide quickly, and that's been used for counter UAS systems. So there are a few things that could still be rushed that are a little bit untapped, but I would say overall, there probably can be 1 or 2 more packages along this line before the end of the administration, but there aren't really any major muscle movers that wouldn't require a lot larger logistical and training trail. What has been given are basically things that Ukraine already knows how to use. So once they're given them, they can pretty much use them right away.
Fascinating. Well, thanks for that, Michael. Let's get to the other big issue of the moment, which is the reduction in airstrikes. And we, of course, have seen an uptick today, but one day does not necessarily make a break of pattern. And the pattern would appear to be that there has been a sizable reduction of Russia's airstrikes on Ukraine in recent months compared to what people expected relative to previous months before that, and indeed the previous year. What is your understanding of the reasons for that? Has it got something to do with Kyiv's ability to strike deeper into Russia, or is something else going on?
The answer is sort of. So I've spoken on the podcast previously. I've written about this also, where the effect of every time you push aircraft back and they have to fly further, it means that you can fly less per day. So as an example, if you can fly within a TACMS range, a plane can average about 1.3 flights a day. If you move it out of a TACMS range to drone range, you're talking about 0.7, so about a 30% reduction. If you have to move them further back, you require air-to-air refueling, and Russia doesn't have much of that. So that becomes a significant bottleneck. Russia does have a fair number of their planes reaching the end of their service life. However, those haven't been used heavily over the past 6 months to a year anyway. It's been mostly the newer planes. So that doesn't quite explain the reduction. I was looking through, and we did see from the Kursk offensive, there was a noticeable surge by Russia of up to 50%. So a part of this could be a bit of a hangover from their Kursk surge, and now they've been drawing back down over the past month or so. But really, it is a little puzzling, because frankly, they're much below what their capacity should be, even if they're operating at a very low rate. So I wish I could give you a better answer, Francis, but it's actually been very puzzling just because they should be able to do much more. And it doesn't make a ton of sense. I do sortie rates quite frequently for acquisition reasons, and it is very low, especially over the last month.
Perhaps there's something political here, which is that they're holding some of this material back to do some really extensive bombardments at the critical moment of the Trump inauguration. I'm just mooting it as a possibility. But I wonder if we can just broaden it out then in terms of the impact more widely of the deeper strike weapons permissions that were given by, whether it be the ATACMS, so there being Washington, and the Storm Shadows, beyond the ability for Russia to be able to strike Ukraine. What has been the impact of that, if anything, over the past, let's say it's been about 3 weeks now, hasn't it?
So outside of the ATACMS, there's the newer, longer-range Ukrainian drones that do the heavy strikes. So it's very hard to hit aircraft with non-cluster munitions. It's very inefficient. It is very efficient, as we've seen over the past few months, for Ukraine to hit munition storages, those large explosions near Moscow that we've seen, and others. And so one potential impact that we are seeing, both in terms of the artillery, the reduction in Russian artillery use, as well as the reduction in bombing use, is these longer range Ukrainian drone strikes, which are 2 or 3 or 4 times of what an ATACMS can do or more. It's forcing munition storages back, which means you're only bringing what you need forward logistically. So if the rail system or the road system is also obstructed, as we've talked about some of the rail sabotage, it has a significant limit on that logistics throughput. So the only thing that might explain this to the degree, if they're not holding a reserve, is that those deep strikes are forcing them to reposition munitions and to change their logistics line. And what you're seeing is as much the cost of changing your whole munitions logistics supply chain and storage, which is a major endeavor. That could be what we're seeing now. And the way to test this long term, I hate to use that, is if in about 2 months we don't see an uptick again, then that tells us there's something else that's significantly either planned or wrong behind the scenes in the Russian system.
Interesting. Well, thanks for that, Michael. Just one final question from me, which is I alluded to earlier on those remarks of President Zelensky and others that F-16s have been involved in the shooting down of missiles. It is, of course, interesting to see those referenced so openly, given they were the subject of so much discussion in previous years and such a major request from the Ukrainians. So my question is, what has been the impact of the F-16s so far on this war?
So The F-16s are basically doing what they're supposed to do. In small numbers, as they've been, a dozen, 2 dozen, they're very capable at air defense. Many European countries for years, that's been their mainline cruise missile defense. And from what we've seen, and what's been reported, that's been pretty effective. At the same time, what's very valuable of F-16s is Russia has reduced using their surface-to-air missiles in a ground strike mode. It is very clear they are now preserving those because it seems as if they perceive F-16s could be a threat. So Russia has held, it looks like they've held some of those S-300 and S-400s that we talk about from striking ground targets. Another thing that is not really discussed where the F-16s are very valuable is Russia spends a lot of effort trying to shoot them on the ground. And when Russia's trying to shoot them on the ground, they're not hitting energy infrastructure and they're not hitting troops at the front. So that's not necessarily something that we think about, but that's actually F-16s early on, their biggest value was getting shot at. And one thing that also would help explain a little bit of the drawdown in strikes would be if for a while Russia was really unopposed in the air. And if they have to transition some of their fighters from a strike role to an escort role because of a perceived F-16 threat, that also would further reduce the strike capacity. So F-16s, what they are doing is exactly what they should be doing. It's the cruise missile defense and being that real or perceived threat to divert munitions away from striking critical infrastructure and people.
Really interesting. Thank you, Michael. Well, before we just go to our final thoughts, are there any other subjects that we've not talked about in your segment today that's of interest that perhaps isn't really on the public agenda at the moment?
Not quite. This is something that was just forming, but there was this very large airstrike that was done overnight. And of course, we don't know the exact numbers, but it was a high number of cruise missiles. And something that Russia did for Syria in the 2010s was massive use of bombers to interdict rebel forces. And Russia didn't really try that at all this time. And no one really understood why. And so I think bombers can't necessarily go between dropping gravity bombs like we think of and cruise missiles very easily. And so I do wonder if Russia in many ways sacrificed Syria for this relatively ineffective airstrike. It's just something to consider if they actually held their bombers in reserve to do this. Either they were too brittle to change or they just weren't able to. But I think that's something that we need to consider is did Russia make such a short-term decision to sacrifice Syria for one night of airstrikes?
The frontline city of Kharkiv is around 400 kilometers east of Kyiv and just 30 kilometers from the Russian border. More than perhaps any other city in Ukraine, it has endured, as has the region surrounding it, the grueling brutality of what it means to be under bombardment and, in parts, subjugation in a 21st century conflict. It is rare for a day to go by without sirens, an example of which you'll hear in a moment, one of many we heard while we were there last month. For this is a city that the Russians sought to take by force more than once, including this year. Over the next few weeks, you'll learn more about this city clinging to normality, about the experiences its people have endured, the volunteers it relies upon to keep going, the creative ways its people have evolved to live with omnipresent dangers, and how, despite it all, signifiers of a free society, like a cultural scene, endure and even thrive. Today, you'll hear some of the sounds we heard upon our arrival, and others shared with us by locals, revealing the soundtrack to their lives. Then, my interview with the man with overall responsibility for the entire region, which, before the full-scale invasion, had a population of 1.5 million. Welcome to Kharkiv, the frontline city at the front line of Ukraine's and Europe's security. Well, a short time ago we arrived here in Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv. What one immediately notices when you arrive here is how much more Russian it feels architecturally. We're 30 kilometers from the border, and there is a sense of the Soviet past very strongly. Although, fascinatingly, when one arrives at the station, you see the hammer and sickles, you see the Soviet realism in mosaic, but you also see the trident, the symbol of Ukraine that's been inserted over the top. And there's lots of posters and imagery relating to the war that say things like Ukraine must be brave, Ukraine is strong. And so you feel the sense of the war here, as well as, of course, the soldiers that are a constant presence. And yet the city lives on. Cars are driving past and people are going about their business. We're now going down into a metro station, which of course is a makeshift bomb shelter, as well as being somewhere that a school operates. Well, I can think of worse places to spend an air raid. A full bar. I'm absolutely relishing it. A lot of limoncello, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, but there's some good craft beers here. There's some absolutely quality whiskies as well. Dom is going to love this. So by the time he arrives, let's just hope there's enough left for him. So we're in the centre of Kharkiv now, and you can probably just hear the air raid siren dying away. We were eating dinner, we just left the restaurant and we're about to have a drink somewhere when the air raid siren went off, and we're now heading back towards the shelter. But you don't feel that this is a city that's necessarily panicking, but is just prepared for this as being an ordinary part of everyday life. And the remarkable thing when you're here is that you're walking past restaurants and bars, and they're not busy, but there are people in them living everyday life. And when the air raid siren goes off, they act. When I was on my phone earlier on, just browsing on Google to see what the restaurants were, I was getting recommendations from inside Russia, in Belgorod, where Ukrainian forces have, over the last few years, been operating and crossed the border to attack there. It just speaks to how close we are to the forces that occupied territory around here not so long ago. You're about to hear three sounds common in Kharkiv. The first is the ominous hum of a Russian drone flying over the house of our translator, Luda, whose voice you'll hear in a future episode. The second, the sound of Ukrainian anti-aircraft fire, which I heard late one night, followed by the kinds of explosions that follow whenever missiles land, in this case recorded by our translator's daughter while out on a walk. Oleh Synyehubov is the governor of Kharkiv Oblast, appointed in December 2021, mere weeks before the full-scale invasion which sought to see Kharkiv fall within days. Born in 1983 and a lawyer by training, old photographs show a clean-shaven man in tight-fitting suits. Now he is bearded and in the type of military-style fatigues so often seen on President Zelensky. I spoke to him in his office to hear his perspective on wielding such responsibility, the challenges that come with it, and what he would say to the world and do to me if I were Vladimir Putin. The governor is voiced by Jordan Young, the recording handled expertly by Adley Pojman-Ponte and Jack Lever, with thanks to Luda, our translator too. Governor, thank you very much for your time today. For those who aren't familiar with the work of a governor of an oblast in Ukraine, what does your average day look like?
Важке питання. З одного боку,
It's a difficult question. On the one hand, it looks typical, and the challenges we have are typical, unfortunately. There's constant shelling, constant strikes on the city of Kharkiv. We're providing the civilian component needed for life. This is providing electricity, water supply, heating. These are humanitarian challenges faced by our civilians, well, and of course, providing everything necessary for our military who are on the front line.
Звичайно, забезпечення всім необхідним наших військових, які стоять на лінії фронту.
Well, let's start with the military side then. One of the unique things about the Oblast is that it is so close to the front line. What unique challenges does that bring to be governing a territory that is so close to the Russian Federation and its armies?
Так, дійсно, по-перше, ми враховуючи те, що і наша...
Yes, indeed. Firstly, given our proximity to the border with the Russian Federation, this is why we are facing various types of weapons. S-300 systems in Iskander, for example. We have to save the lives of people, children who find themselves under the rubble. There are also the challenges of evacuating the population because the front line is unstable. The zone of active hostilities is expanding, and of course we have to deal with evacuation there. Since May, we have evacuated more than 20,000 people from dangerous territories. This causes resettlement and humanitarian challenges, sending people to other, safer territories. These are the challenges we constantly face due to the proximity to the terrorist country.
Тобто, ось такі виклики у нас пов'язані постійно з близькістю.
I'll come back to some questions about the specific humanitarian elements in a moment, but we were reporting on the delay for weapons permissions, which was, of course, particularly important around the time of the Kharkiv offensive a few months ago. How did it feel being here in Kharkiv and governing the Oblast at a time when the Russians were so close but were not able to be hit by Allied weapons?
Я дозволю собі відповісти більш ширше.
I will answer more broadly, not only about the delay in supply, but also about the fact that the Kharkiv region serves as a kind of marker, reflecting the impact of decisions made by Western and European partners regarding the authorization of certain types of weapons in specific territories. The war is progressing rapidly. This is no secret. However, decisions by Western and European partners are currently delayed by at least 6 months, sometimes even a year. In 2022, we experienced daily strikes, day and night, with more than 10 S-300 missiles. The situation was the same in 2023, when our state leadership, including the president, requested permission to strike specific territories using HIMARS and other systems, knowing exactly where the enemy's S-300 and Iskander missile systems targeting Kharkiv were located. Permission was delayed. Meanwhile, we endured destruction and civilian casualties. By spring of this year, Kharkiv's entire energy infrastructure, its electrical grid, heat supply, and power-generating enterprises was completely destroyed. In March and May, there were massive strikes involving over 30 missiles in combined attacks. When permission was finally granted, those enemy systems were swiftly destroyed, and missile strikes on Kharkiv using S-300 and S-400 systems effectively stopped. This was more the exception than the rule, but the results were immediate. However, the enemy adapted, switching to guided aerial and glide bombs, systems with ranges of 80 to 90 kilometers, capable of striking any point in Kharkiv. We know where these launches originate, from Belgorod in the Russian Federation, yet they continue to hit residential areas, causing more civilian casualties. Once again, the president of Ukraine requested permission to strike military equipment depots, ammunition storage sites, and factories producing these bombs to protect civilians, but we have been waiting for nearly half a year or longer. To give a specific example, guided aerial bombs that struck Kharkiv on August 30th were manufactured just days earlier, on August 24th. These facts are confirmed by markings and other evidence. The production of such weapons is ongoing, and we must act to counter this threat.
І з цим ми маємо боротись.
Given what you've just said about the ramifications of the delays to weapons deliveries, if it was just you and me in a room, but I'm Olaf Scholz, I'm President Biden, I'm President Macron, I'm Prime Minister Starmer, what would you say to me directly? What would be the message from Kharkiv to these world leaders who have hesitated for so long?
по-перше, потрібно зрозуміти остаточну позицію.
First of all, it's important to understand the ultimate position. Are we going to win this war or not? What is the goal? If the aim is to delay decisions while justifying it by claiming to avoid escalation, that reasoning no longer holds. The entire world already sees this clearly. The issue is no longer about escalation. When a medium-range ballistic missile designed to carry a nuclear charge is being used, it's a clear signal that the person behind such actions has completely lost touch with reality. This demands more than expressions of deep concern, as we often hear from the UN and similar organizations. A decisive course of action is urgently needed. The question is whether there is genuine support for Ukraine's victory, or if supporting Ukraine is merely about looking good in the eyes of the voters. It's time to make a firm decision on where we stand. If we have committed to supporting Ukraine's victory, then immediate measures must be taken, not only to contain Russia, but to defeat it. This would compel Russia to agree to end the war and achieve a just peace for Ukraine, as President Zelensky has repeatedly emphasized.
Як це каже відповідно президент Зеленський.
For as long as it takes is often the phrase, but to do what, right? One more question, if I may, on the military before moving into the domestic sphere. Was there ever a point that you thought you might need to leave Kharkiv, that Kharkiv itself might be lost to the Russians?
Щодо евакуації Харкова, то це майже відбулося.
The evacuation of Kharkiv nearly took place in the spring of 2022, when almost the entire population left the city. Out of a population of 2 million, only a little more than 300,000 people remained. Since then, many residents have returned as the situation at the front improved. As for me personally, I never considered leaving. Kharkiv is my home.
Moving into the humanitarian domestic sphere then, as you alluded to earlier on, a lot of your priority is focused on the military sphere, but hospitals still need to run, municipal services. Which is the biggest of those that causes you the most problems?
Дивіться, по-перше, це велика відповідальність.
People often ask, how do you manage work here? The answer lies in recognizing the enormous responsibility we have. The Kharkiv region is vast and strategically significant. We understand our position, as demonstrated by our people and military during the spring of 2022. Even in extremely difficult conditions, our primary challenge was ensuring the continuity of essential services. When some residents stayed behind, even if only a small proportion, we had to rebuild and maintain a functioning healthcare system, keep medical institutions operating, and provide education in bomb shelters. State authorities had to ensure the delivery of essential services to the population. Even basic necessities like food became critical. With logistics disrupted, supermarket shelves began to empty within 3 days of Kharkiv's near-total occupation. Let me ask you a simple question. How much food do you have at home right now? Imagine running out, with your family and children depending on you, and having nowhere to buy supplies, all while living in a city of 1 million people. These were some of the most urgent challenges we faced and overcame. Of course, mistakes were made along the way, but we learned from them. Today, we are even ready to share the experience we gained through these difficult times.
With that point in mind, obviously the experience of war, whether it be in domestic or it be in the military context, is extreme here versus other oblasts. Do they share knowledge, or is it often a battle for resources from Kyiv, from the centre?
Звичайно, у нас налагоджена комунікація.
Of course, we established effective communication under the leadership of the President's office and the Cabinet of Ministers. Only a small number of governors have managed their regions throughout the entire war, from February 24th, 2022 to the present. Additionally, the President's directive has ensured that other regions support frontline areas like ours. They provided food, fuel, generators, and other essential supplies. The principle is clear. Rear regions must support the frontline regions today so they themselves won't become frontline areas tomorrow. This has been the government's consistent stance. As for competition over resources, such as with Kyiv or elsewhere, that issue has never arisen in the past 3 years. We've never had to argue or justify our need for specific funding or resource allocations. Perhaps this is because I've served as head of the administration for 5 years and have built close working relationships with the cabinet of ministers. We maintain direct contact with all the ministers and the Prime Minister. Most issues are resolved quickly, either over the phone or online. Of course, the President's office has played a crucial role, helping us navigate these communications and providing essential leadership throughout.
Well, speaking of the President, one of his priorities in office has been tackling institutional corruption in Kyiv and across the country. I wonder what initiatives he himself has been involved in trying to tackle that.
Дивіться, це дійсно пріоритетне питання.
This is truly a priority and a fundamental issue we face frequently. One of the core principles is that war cannot be used as an excuse to overlook or write off anything. War conditions create unique challenges. In peacetime, established anti-corruption mechanisms operate smoothly, but during war these mechanisms can fall short, especially in areas like public procurement, where processes that normally take 1 or 2 months must be completed within days to get supplies to the front line. This urgency naturally increases corruption risks, which we fully acknowledge. The key challenge is figuring out how to manage and mitigate these risks. In addition to applying existing safeguards outlined in the law, we've introduced extra measures that go beyond legal requirements. For example, we created a dedicated platform within the administration, essentially forming a social contract. We respond openly to any concerns brought to us and are prepared to engage in transparent public discussions. I'll give you a concrete example. An organization once accused us of alleged misconduct related to purchasing raw materials for fortification construction. In response, we gathered all contractors, invited journalists, and reached out to the organization making the accusations. We arranged a public forum, live-streamed and open to the media, where they could raise their concerns directly and receive immediate answers. Unfortunately, the accusers did not attend, nor did they connect online, despite multiple invitations. It became clear that their mission was limited to making accusations, and they were no longer interested in pursuing the issue further, a disappointing outcome for us. Nevertheless, this is how a process should work. When a concern is raised, there must be a prompt and transparent response. We are committed to being honest, transparent and accountable, not only to European partners, but also to our own society, which rightly demands justice. Finally, I should note that Ukraine has developed a highly complex system of anti-corruption bodies, all of which are actively working. Believe me, it's quite difficult for any wrongdoing to go unnoticed. If misconduct occurs, it will be uncovered, and those responsible will face their punishment.
One final question on this, since you mentioned it. When I was last here 7 months ago, soldiers told me that they felt there were issues with fortifications, not just in Kharkiv, but in other places as well, that resources had not been put in, that the defences were not adequate enough, and that in subsequent offences, so that meant that they were not able to defend themselves adequately, and many of them were killed. Are you confident now that those issues from before have been solved?
I understand what you're saying. We faced a similar situation in the Kharkiv region when there was an offensive from the north. It's crucial to understand that everyone is responsible for their specific area of work. As for regional administrations, I can speak for myself. We were tasked by the President and the government with constructing the third line of defense, which is located much deeper than the current front line. This means our military weren't stationed in those positions directly. The responsibility fell to the soldiers on the first line, who had to prepare those positions themselves, sometimes holding them for a year or a year and a half. Currently, criminal proceedings are underway, and investigations are being conducted. I believe society will eventually get answers about why this happened, whether the fortifications were properly prepared, and who should bear responsibility for this. It's also important to direct this question to the right people, and that would likely be the military leadership. They are the ones organizing the defense and overseeing the entire front. With all due respect, the soldiers stationed on the lines have their own perspective on the fortifications they're defending, on who should be responsible for them, and whether they were adequately equipped. These are questions that fall within the military leadership's responsibility.
Some final questions. There are those in Kyiv, in the West more widely, who talk now quite openly following the election of President Trump about the idea of negotiations. of some kind of peace deal or at least a ceasefire. Your city is very much on the front line. What is your view? Is the time now for talks with Russia?
Дивіться, тут, по-перше, щодо часу розмов.
First, regarding the timing of negotiations, I'll defer to our president, as this falls outside my direct area of responsibility. Ukraine has never categorically refused negotiations. However, as our president has repeatedly stated, Russia has consistently approached talks with ultimatums, issuing demands one after the other. In response, the president of Ukraine proposed a peace plan early on, which received broad support from most European nations, democratic countries, and the wider international community. More recently, a national resilience plan has also been introduced. This plan is entirely reasonable, built on the principles of global security outlined by the United Nations, the Budapest Memorandum, and other international agreements. Under these terms, Ukraine has always been open to dialogue. Unfortunately, no genuine willingness to engage has ever come from the Russian side.
We have a tendency, inevitably, when talking about politics and military affairs, to talk in the abstract about losses on the battlefield, challenges with economics. But as somebody who represents so many people in this oblast, are there any particularly emotional or tragic stories that live in your mind? We have just come from interviewing people who lived formerly in territories in this oblast that were under Russian occupation and suffered terribly as a consequence. I wonder, when you reflect on their experiences, what comes to your mind when you go home at the end of the day and think about them?
Що найважче? Ось наразі.
Believe me, with all the challenges we've faced and everything our people have endured, some things remain almost impossible to comprehend. Even when a shell or bomb hits a residential building, a multi-story apartment or a house, we often speak about it. But truly grasping the horror is another matter altogether. It's especially hard when our rescuers pull the bodies of children from the rubble. What can you say to a mother who fainted after putting her 2 children to bed the night before, only to awaken in a hospital asking where her children are, when they are no longer alive? What words could possibly explain to her that her life, in so many ways, is over? It's not just that life will never be the same, it's that her world is gone, and now she must carry this unbearable pain in her heart for the rest of her life. In the 21st century, in the heart of Europe, we should never have had to erect a monument to dead children. In our region alone, 91 children have died, the youngest only 3 months old. How can anyone explain to them, lives stolen before they could fully begin, that they faced the cruelest side of humanity and would never have the chance to grow up? This is the hardest reality we are living through right now.
Thank you. Well, before I give you the opportunity to offer your final thoughts, anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to, my final question is, I painted a scenario earlier on where I was President Biden, Olaf Scholz. If I was Putin, what would you say to me? How do you feel about the Russians who are so nearby, who have committed these crimes against your city?
Well, I don't have a weapon with me now, so you're just lucky, let's say. But you know, it's probably not even about him, right? The entire country is unwell. In 2022, we learned that more than 70% of the population of Russia supported the military invasion. The entire country requires treatment, and that treatment must be forceful. I don't mean just military force, I'm talking about sanctions as well. People must understand that living in a totalitarian state is wrong. It's simply not beneficial. If you choose that path, then you will face restrictions, economic, political, and others. This is how we must proceed. But the key takeaway, the larger lesson, is something else. This is a lesson for the entire world. Ukraine is a challenge and a lesson for the world. This situation has shown that the systems in place for decades, the safeguards, the collective security frameworks, are failing. Something is wrong with the world, and something is wrong with how we approach collective security. So moving forward, we must begin thinking about how to construct a new system. A new approach to UN decision-making, to the UN Security Council and other international structures. This is not just about Ukraine. Ukraine is merely the example that demonstrates how all of this, unfortunately, is not working.
Thank you. So are there any thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with? Anything perhaps that we haven't talked about that's on your mind that should be on ours?
Ви знаєте, досить важливо, щоб зрозумілось. Ми, наприклад, нещодавно
You know, it's quite important to understand. For example, we recently signed a memorandum of cooperation with the state of Ohio in the USA. When our delegation was there, even regular politicians didn't fully grasp what was happening in Ukraine. It's crucial that citizens of the United Kingdom and the US and other European countries understand that Ukraine is currently an outpost. It truly is an outpost. Kharkiv is an outpost of Ukrainian and European democracy, of the values that in principle are shared worldwide. Just imagine this, and these aren't just words, we didn't really believe in it either. We knew likely there would be a war, but we didn't believe it was actually possible. Ask an average citizen of a European country, Poland, Germany, England, if they could imagine war tomorrow, nearly 99% would say it's impossible. But what if it's possible? What if it's World War III? What if it's a war involving a country that disregards all agreements, values, security pacts, and everything else? That's why, to ensure this doesn't happen tomorrow, we need to focus on the priorities. And the priority is security, people's lives. We must support Ukraine until its victory. And I want to thank you, last of all, for being here in the city of Kharkiv. As the First Lady said, this city represents the coordinates of strength, and the people of Kharkiv are the coordinates of strength. You are here to tell the world the truth. This is invaluable to be in a war zone with Kharkiv not just being near the front line, but a frontline city. You came to hear the truth and see the people living in these conditions every day. When journalists came in 2022 and 2023 and asked, "How are you here in these conditions?" we explained it like this. Imagine you're planning for tomorrow, taking your children to school, buying groceries, updating your phone, maybe even considering a new car. But then, in an hour, everything changes. Your only priority becomes survival. It's no longer about money, possessions, or relationships. It's about staying alive in the horror of it all. This is not just a crisis, it's an apocalypse, one that could only be depicted in the highest quality European and Western films. That's how we are living.
As you say, Ukraine is the front line and Kharkiv is the front line of the front line.
Да.
Дякую.
І вам дякую.
Thank you for being here at this time.
Let's go to our final thoughts now then. To those of you who are asking what happened when I arrived at Telegraph Towers only to find Dom had covered my desk with stickers of his face, yes, I was appalled. Yes, I was thankfully able to remove them. And yes, I will get my revenge in due course. I mention it here because while we're on the subject of gifts, cards and general correspondence, just a huge thank you, as ever, to everyone who reaches out. It's humbling, amazing and so appreciated. We all see you here as an extended family. A special nod to Ian Zong for the annotated book and the pod of ink, which I'm afraid Ian shattered in transit, but thankfully didn't damage the other goodies, including the books. But I feel sorry for the producer who had to pick it up, and there was rather a lot of ink on his hands when he came back, bless him. But also to Todd Hunter of Wisconsin for the jam mug, DVDs and other edibles. Ever since Dom mentioned the eccentric condiments we received from the other side of the world the other week to keep our spirits up, we've been getting more of them. One of the most eccentric has been banana ketchup from the Philippines. The less said about that, the better, I'm afraid. I haven't actually been brave enough to try it yet, but it's currently on David's desk, and so we appreciate looking at it and having a laugh amongst ourselves. But on a more serious note, I mentioned David there, and last night was the annual British Journalism Awards here, organised by the Press Gazette, where along with Dom, David's parents, his partner Adley, and other Telegraph colleagues, we were honoured to pick up a posthumous award to David for public service journalism. And the Gazette gave us the opportunity to say a few words, and I was very pleased to do so to the great and the good who were assembled there. And I used the opportunity to draw attention to the plight of Ukraine's children and the latest Yale report, which of course was the special subject of Tuesday's episode. I just didn't think David would forgive me if I didn't use the platform to try and do some good and raise awareness of that issue, which in my view and many, many others, is widely underreported. And I'm pleased to say that since then, several journalists have contacted me this morning asking for more information. Next week, you will hear David's voice again. I'm very pleased to say it's going to be a really big week as we formally launch our Christmas fundraiser. But more on that on Monday. And until then, Michael, you have the last word today.
This actually is something that we probably would still be talking about if it wasn't Syria, but the intercontinental ballistic missile attack on Ukraine, there's been a lot of discussion about nuclear escalation and nuclear bluffing. And just something that really hasn't been highlighted is Vladimir Putin is very afraid of his mortality. A man that makes people sit 40 feet away from him, or as the last number I saw, has spent several $1 billion on life extension technologies and startups, is probably not someone that wants to set in motion a chain of events that could lead to him dying, either from a nuclear war or what a lot of people forget is many oligarchs. Their children are in European capitals studying or living today. And that's something that, while they've not cracked so far, the potential loss of children might change that. Normally I talk technical topics at the end, but just from a nuclear escalation perspective, no one ever talks about why someone afraid of death would actually follow through on a bluff. And the U.S. strategic side always says you never bluff with nuclear weapons because the other side never knows. This is something where even continuously bluffing, someone who's afraid of death that much is probably not actually serious. So I'll just leave that as a thought for the end of the day.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins and Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.